Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well. Got a nice tub of ice cream here. Yes, I know, fucking weird, I know. And then I've got a coffee that I accidentally put 3 times the normal amount of fucking coffee in. Because I accidentally spilled God knows how much into it by being an idiot and pouring the fucking coffee thingy in Nescafe. That's what it is. But still, hopefully the bottom line on that one is it's going to wake me up. At least that was what I was going for anyway. Oh dear. But hopefully, I'm not going to be having 14 strokes on this one. At least that's the thing I'm banking on anyway. So we're continuing from about halfway down on page 208. From when I mentioned the largest taxpayer bailout in the world. In the history of the world, no less. So, let's get the show on the road while we're at it. It was later revealed that the Federal Reserve, the US Central Bank, had gone even further than originally reported, secretly lending big banks around the world nearly $16 trillion. This was by far the most audacious monetary fiscal experiment in history, all aimed at keeping a moribund system going. But it was just the beginning. I think I need to up the dosage. Despite the size of the US bailout, it didn't work. So the American Central Bank employed an idea called quantitative easing, or QE, meaning the central bank would buy government debt using newly created money. But the US Central Bank wasn't alone in employing QE, nor did it invent it. In 2008, the aim behind QE was, and I quote, first, to enable the US government to borrow unprecedented amounts of money and spend it in an attempt to revive the economy. Second, to recapitalize the banks, keeping them alive and hopefully convincing them to start lending again. End quote. While the amount of money involved was shockingly large and contentious at the time, it was dwarfed by the subsequent bouts of money printing because the first bout of QE didn't work. This was followed with further money printing in 2010, and that was QE2, and in 2012, I'm struggling with words here, QE3, and then 0% interest rates. The response to the COVID pandemic, or maybe I was right first time, March 2020, could be described as QE4. Central banks who engaged in QE include those of the USA, UK, EU, China, Japan, Sweden, and Switzerland. Thus, we see that this further inflation of the money bubble truly spanned the globe. When the Money Bubble book was published in 2013, the authors considered to be shocking the level of the US central bank assets, i.e. bonds and toxic debt bought through fake money. The value of these assets stood at $4 trillion. After QE2, 3, and 4 of the scamdemic, the assets the US central bank had bought got close to $9 trillion. In May 2024, the assets it bought are valued at around $7.5 trillion. Before QE started in 2008, the assets of the US central bank were valued at less than $1 trillion. You can see the effects this withdrawal of money from the money bubble is having with the financial problems in the UK and Europe in particular, but also with the political conflict in Europe. In the past, economic bubbles basically gave some individuals a position in a casino of fantasies. Some might be able to cash out before their luck changed and the bubble collapsed. But in the money bubble, everything happens on a grand scale, at the national and international level. It meant that countries were able to finance welfare programs, infrastructure projects, and military aggression overseas using the fake money from the bubble. Consider the fact that no major country balances its budget anymore, while all engage in historically unprecedented deficit spending and money printing. Viewed through this lens, quantitative easing is subprime lending on a global scale. Oh, fatigue, tiredness, fuck off. Anyway, the oligarchy are not going to manage the deflation of the money bubble. They will keep going until it bursts. The most they will do is engineer a narrative so that something or someone else is blamed when the economy implodes. See chapter 4.7. The debasement of money can happen slowly or quickly. During the Roman Empire, coins went from containing 85% silver to containing 0.05 silver over a period of 250 years. Twice in the 18th century alone, French governments produced vastly more paper currency than was backed by tangible assets, causing economic bubbles and runaway inflation. Between World War I and World War II, Germany had one of the most notorious bouts of hyperinflation in history. That was just 100 years ago, but most people have learned nothing. In any group of people in the last century, if any group of people in the last century have worried about the inflationary effects of fiat currency, it is a significant minority of Americans, and with good reason. Currency debasement and hyperinflation were known at the very foundations of America. During the American War of Independence, the colonies needed equipment and supplies to defend themselves against the British Empire. The Continental Congress responded by creating a new paper currency with the promise that after the war, the notes would be paid off with tax revenues. The war lasted longer than expected. Far too many Continentals were created, and the currency's value evaporated. In 1779, $100 worth of gold or silver coins would buy 2,600 face value of Continentals. 2 years later, the same coins bought $16,800 of Continentals. Within another 2 years, Continentals had become worthless, wiping out many of the soldiers and other patriots who believed their government's promises. As the saying goes, those who do not learn from history are destined to repeat its mistakes. So money debasement is at the root of American history. The money bubble is not just inflated by government borrowing and central bank printing of fake money and the fractional reserve banking creation of credit by commercial banks. That's all bad enough. There's also a time bomb named derivatives. Or maybe the crash I'm going to suffer if I don't get more coffee in my system. Anyway, if the subprime mortgage casino was enough to bring down the global financial system, then these are far more serious. They truly show how much of a casino is the financial sector. These contracts are bets on some financial event occurring. Because there is no limit on how many contracts can be written on a given bond, issue, or currency position or whatever, the amount of derivatives that can be created is effectively infinite. As a result, banks and hedge funds now treat this market as a casino, making bets and collecting fees in ever-increasing amounts. The face value of all derivatives outstanding in 2013 was about $693 trillion, or nearly 10 times the size of the entire global economy. Remember, the asset sheet of the US central bank stood at $4 trillion in 2013. Yet the authors of the money bubble are pointing out that the face value of all the derivative financial instruments stood at nearly 175 times that amount. The size of the money bubble is mind-boggling. The oligarchy are able to corner wealth in many different places, so-called financial instruments. Strange gambles kept hidden from the public. But when push comes to shove and collapse happens, it's the farmed animals who are expected to bear the gambling risks of the oligarchy. They have their wealth hidden away in various places, the Channel Isles, the Caribbean islands, etc., etc., often in multiple different countries. New Zealand is one place where they buy second homes, probably because it will be so far from a nuclear World War III. You might be thinking, but those in power would never let these risky gambles imperil the economies of most of the world. But you would have thought the same about the subprime mortgage scam and the subsequent Great Financial Crisis, or the GFC. When this financially broke, economists and commentators said at the time and in the years after, no one saw it coming. You can get a sense of the magnitude of that economic earthquake by the fact that Queen Elizabeth famously asked, "Why did no one see it coming?" But it's not true that no one saw it coming. There were those who saw the 2006 to 2008 financial collapse coming, and they placed bets in the casino. See the movie The Big Short. And they made a fortune from their bets. There were others like financial analyst Peter Schiff, who in the years of 2002 to 2008 was often invited onto the finance programs, I'm really struggling with words, of major TV networks, and he was warning them over and over of the risks of what was to come. It seems that he was simply invited onto these programs so that the hosts and other financial analysts could laugh at him, and in doing so herd the sheeple back into the investments the oligarchy want the public to make. The oligarchy farm us like animals, and the easiest way to get the herd moving in one direction is through the oligarchy's control of the mainstream media. By paying attention to mainstream media, you are choosing to be herded. Schiff is one of the rare financial analysts opposed to the casino of Wall Street in the City of London. If social media should offer too much resistance to us being herded, then dissident voices are banned from social media, and the oligarchy attempts to crush any company that does not comply. Once the GFC finally broke in 2007 to 2008, the TV companies placed an embargo on Schiff being invited onto the program. Keeping warnings from him muted meant the oligarchy could keep lying so that to the public that no one saw it coming. Schiff himself has commented both on how it's a lie when they say no one saw it coming, and on how he's been blacklisted from TV since the Great Financial Collapse. In 2023, mainstream financial analysts were once again pointing out the Queen Elizabeth's question has returned again, as Schiff had warned repeatedly. Those with political power simply concealed the economic problems, which should tell you why the oligarchy is provoking World War III. The pieces of which they started to put in play at the latest in 2008, see chapter 4.7 below, things are worse now than in the run-up to the GFC. The oligarchy are confident that the vast majority of us farmed animals are not paying attention to the economics, to people like Schiff, to the game being played out in Ukraine, the Middle East, and in Southeast Asia. If even 20% of us were paying attention to Schiff, his videos would have gone from YouTube. He might be lucky and keep his Twitter account. Schiff's father died in prison for telling the American public that income tax was against the US Constitution. The oligarchy power and riches since World War I comes from their ability to print money, manage the economy, which itself, on their ability to tax farmed animals. But the masses must be kept distracted by bread and circuses. Those who benefit from the massive casino of derivative gambles say that there's nothing to worry about, but the Great Financial Crisis of 2008 tells us otherwise. In that the Great Financial Collapse, the bundles of subprime mortgages supposedly balanced each other out. Every ex-dodgy mortgage was hedged by Y-sound mortgages. But seemingly modest net derivatives exposure was revealed to depend on counterparties like Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, and AIG, a massive insurance company. Oh, full stop. When those firms imploded, one side of trillions of dollars of derivatives defaulted, leaving the remaining counterparty suddenly unhedged, that is, liable for other contracts without the expected protection from the now defaulted contracts. The net derivatives exposure became irrelevant. coming within days of complete corporate evaporation and the banks only surviving because of an absolutely unprecedented government bailout. Just so you can get an idea of the scale of the risks some of these banks are taking, in 2013, Deutsche Bank notional derivatives account was itself 21 times larger than the entire economy of Germany. Over 20 years ago, Warren Buffett, one of the richest men in the world, was describing derivatives as financial weapons of mass destruction. Now, that's something new for me. Oh, watch out for those green queens flying overhead. They're going to strike our capital city any minute now. Anyway, but the bankers all cream off a percentage of what's going on in the casino, and governments then take a share of these profits in taxes. And because the public is no wiser, the game of pass the parcel just keeps on going. But 2008 was a warning of what happens when the music stops. That the derivatives accounts of a single bank can be 15 to 20 times the size of an entire economy of a country which houses that bank should give you a clear image. Stroke number one. It had to happen sooner or later. Give you a clear image of what the money bubble looks like. On the basis of relatively little in the way of assets, massive speculation takes place in the financial casino. To be fair, I did rather well. 16 minutes, and this is the first stroke I've had, considering in 50 minutes I've had 14, but I digress. When the bubble bursts, the effects can be devastating. In the case of the 1929 Wall Street crash, the value of shares fell 25% in 2 days. And over the following years, the Dow Jones index of share prices fell almost 90%. The Dow Jones index did not return to the heights of the pre-crash days for 25 years after the crash. The world of banking is stuffed with greedy people. Greed is their principal motivation. The shareholders who profit from the rapacious attitudes of the bankers are no better. The banking world comes to be populated with the kinds of people who pioneered subprime mortgages and liar loans, and people who currently operate in investment banks and view customers as prey to be exploited. Meanwhile, in today's fiat money system, the government, Fed, and other central banks and major banks get to use that newly created currency before its rising supply lowers its value, giving a huge advantage to the government-sanctioned banking monopoly. And banks, facing the pressures mentioned earlier, have been using this money in increasingly aggressive ways, creating products like asset-backed bonds, junk bonds, and over-the-counter derivatives that generate fees in a moment, but vastly increase systemic leverage and fragility. In effect, the largest banks have become hedge funds, rolling the dice with their depositors' money. With some of the profits from their gambling, they buy special treatment from their friends in government. In All the President's Bankers, I'm guessing that's a film or a book, former banker Nomi Prinz wrote a detailed, carefully researched 500-page book documenting the revolving door between the people who run the American political system and the big banks throughout the 20th century. The people who own the banks are also the people who own the political system. Whether it's the right or the left in power, they are all in bed with the bankers. That those close to the source of newly created fake money get to spend the money before it loses its value, i.e. before the inflationary consequences are felt, has been known to economics since 1755. Naturally, those who are closer to the creation of fake money want to keep the public unaware of this, and so the public are led to believe that there are no consequences to the creation of fake money by governments and their bankers. Despite all the damage done to the economy of the West over the past century, the bankers at the top of the banking cartel never go to prison. The cases of more lowly bankers going to prison occasionally happen, but are so rare the public can remember the names of the bankers. For example, Nick Leeson, the stroke number two, the derivatives trader who actions ended up destroying Barings Bank in 1995. One rogue employee, a 28-year-old at the time, who grew up on a council estate and apparently failed A-level mathematics, was able to bring about the collapse of a single bank. But when the bankers who hobnob with the inner circle of the White House nearly brought down the entire global economy, not one of them was punished. It's clear from the story of Leeson that he made rapid progress in banking precisely because they played fast and loose. Barring's bank collapsed more than a decade before the scandal of the GFC, but still the banks, in their cosy alliance with politicians, were too busy fleecing the public to think they needed to be more careful with the oversight of their financial products. In Britain, those members of the oligarchy awarded honorary degrees knighted for their services to the oligarchy, to the country, sorry, not the oligarchy, getting the two words mixed up, different lines. People in charge of banks that would have collapsed without huge government bailouts using taxpayer money in 2009. Those people escaped scot-free, apart from a bit of tut-tutting in the state-controlled media. So the bankers keep their money and privilege, while their losses are passed on to the general public, when the public are already the people disproportionately suffering the consequences of an inflated money supply. When governments lie about inflation, and the interest rates in banks are in reality far below the rate of inflation, that this encourages a culture of debt rather than of saving, particularly taking out debt to buy a tangible asset like property, which is perceived as being safe as houses. In addition to this, with young people being deceived about the value of a university degree, an entire generation have been trained to be in debt when this was something their grandparents would mostly have avoided. UK adults aged 34 to 45 have average savings that are less than 25% of those aged 55 to 64. In 1994, the outstanding balances on credit cards in the UK was £10 billion. Just a decade later, the outstanding balances totaled £60 billion. As recently as 2011, only 19% of those aged 15 to 24, aged 15 to 24, I don't know why the percentage tried to chip in there, had a credit card, but by 2024, 68% of this age group had credit cards. Moreover, in 2011, 40% of the poorest section of society had credit cards, but by 2024, this was 69%. Nice. Sorry. Of that demographic. Around 65% of credit cards have an outstanding balance at the end of every month, and 50% of credit cards have a revolving non-discounted balance outstanding each month. The number of cards used with the balance paid off before interest is due is only 8.5%. A percent of cards, sorry. Oh, much better. Muslim jurists have ruled that credit cards are haram, forbidden, if interest could be charged. This would make it likely that the indebtedness problem in the UK is greater still, since Muslims need to be removed from the consideration. When government bail out banks and major industrial companies, going so far as to nationalise them, which is the key doctrine of socialism, what the governments are doing is to engender optimism among investors, who are then more willing to borrow and spend because their stock portfolios are rising rather than falling. This so-called wealth effect is now a central lever of government policy. But keeping the stock market inflated isn't the only way that governments manipulate the economy to deceive the voters. They also do this by keeping house prices inflated. Historically, in the UK and USA, most homes were bought not as an investment from which to get rich, but as a place for the owner and their family to live. Central banks and governments didn't set interest rates to game the housing market for electoral gain. For example, during the free terms of the Thatcher government, the Bank of England's interest rate was as high as 17% and never lower than 7%, making life very difficult for voters with mortgages. However, once the 2008 crisis broke, governments and central banks started to stroke number 3, decided to deliberately, I've lost my wording here, deliberately manipulate the property market for electoral purposes. Sorry, I had to find myself again because that stroke was a pretty strong one for me. Anyway, they did this by keeping interest rates close to zero for 13 years, and by other forms of government intervention, such as temporarily getting rid of the purchase tax, stamp duty, on homes costing below the average house price. When the initial attempts to reinflate the money bubble failed after the 2008 crisis, in 2013 the UK's socialist government brought in the Help to Buy scheme, where the government would provide part of a loan to ensure that house prices remained high, rather than have them fall as would happen in a real market. In a real market, prices go up and down, or in some cases they go down and then they plummet. Anyway, this program continued from 2013 to 2023, but similar kinds of government schemes are still running. The government prefers to intervene in the property market rather than let prices fall to a level that people could afford without government schemes. This is the socialist engineering of the market process. One of the groups the oligarchy seeks to buy off is those people who believe the huge increase in the price of their homes is a sign of the success of the economy in general, and of them in particular. Rising home prices are just a means to a positive wealth effect. But ultimately, we should remember that the oligarchy will be heavily invested in the property market, and it is in their interests, as much as those of homeowners, that the government is protecting. It is in the interest of those who cannot afford to buy a house that the prices of houses should fall. However, importing millions of people is a technique to keep property prices inflated, as well as a way to cause cultural strife and population replacement. Chapter 4.6, The Financial Trap. You may think that the bank bail-in laws mentioned earlier will never be used, but that's not how things work. When push comes to shove, the oligarchy first look at what legal options they currently have. And these bail-ins have already been deployed across European countries. Cyprus, a Eurozone country, was the first to go this route in 2013, when its leading banks failed and the rest of the Eurozone insisted that in return for financial assistance it confiscate 47.5% of domestic bank accounts over €100,000. Poland, not a Eurozone member, then followed with its own variation of the bail-in theme, responding to a budgetary shortfall by confiscating the assets of the country's private pension funds, without offering any compensation. Also in 2013, it was revealed that Spain had, in effect, looted its largest public pension fund, the Social Security Reserve Fund, by ordering it to use its cash to buy Spanish government bonds. By year-end, 90% of the €65 billion fund had been invested in Spanish sovereign paper, leaving the fund's beneficiaries dependent on future governments' ability to manage their finances. When you talk to ordinary people about this history of governments raiding banks and pension funds, the average person knows nothing about it. The bail-in principle has been extended from the UK and EU to Switzerland, New Zealand and Canada. The Bank of International Settlements has published a blueprint showing other countries how to use creditors' and depositors' money to recapitalise failed banks. Across the developed world, we can expect to see governments raiding private accounts for the trillions held in them as the money bubble implodes. When the above warning was given in 2013, it may have seemed like a totalitarian nightmare fantasy. But the lockdowns of 2020, the scamdemic lockdowns of 2020, the censorship and surveillance should tell you that these things are not far away and can descend with incredible rapidity. Asset seizures have happened before. In ancient Rome, in England, in the 1530s, with the French Revolution in 1789, and the US Civil War. In World War II, the Japanese interned in America in 1942 had their assets seized. And one could see that the National Socialists did something similar to Jews. We can see how readily the USA and EU were to seize the assets of Russians and the Russian state in 2022. And in return, Russia is seizing assets of Western companies. In 1933, the leftist US President Franklin Roosevelt carried out a massive asset seizure against American citizens. In the USA, up to 1933, there were gold coins circulating as regular money. Roosevelt's government made it illegal to own these coins, everyone having to hand them in for paper dollars. No sooner had they been handed in than the dollars the public received in exchange were devalued by 70%, effectively robbing those who had the gold coins of 70% of the value of that money. Anyone with any sense would have melted down the coins and turned the gold into jewellery. But with all your assets now held in bank accounts, pensions, shares and housing, etc., 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 there will be no escape from future asset seizure. Below £85,000, bank deposits in the UK are supposedly protected by an insurance scheme run collectively by the banks, the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, or the FSCS. Go and search for information about what percentage of bank deposits are covered by these banking insurance schemes. Oh, sorry, I had to sneeze there. You will find the information very hard to come by because it is the deception to get you to keep your money in the financial system and not in tangible assets such as gold and property, etc., etc. The scheme currently pays out about £1 billion in compensation, pounds that is, each year. But in 2008, the Bank of England had to lend money to the FSCS to guarantee the deposits that were in just one troubled bank. But the amount of money protected in a bank account was only raised to £85,000 in 2010. Up until the 2007 collapse of Northern Rock, the FSCS only promised to repay 80% of the first £35,000 held in a failed bank or building society. So in 2008, the insurance scheme didn't have enough money to guarantee deposits up to £35,000 in just one failing bank. What happens in the case of a general banking collapse? Do you think that you will get your money out of the bank even if you only have $30,000 in the bank, when in the previous significant crisis the FSCS did not have the money to cover a single bank? In the press release, the head of the FCS specifically stated they were doing this to support consumer confidence in the financial services industry. All of these things were confidence tricks to get the public to keep their money in places where the oligarchy can enrich themselves from taking some of your money. The oligarchy rely you on not seeing the big picture, not understanding more than simple arithmetic, not remembering things, being distracted by entertainment, etc., etc. The money bubble is itself a huge financial confidence trick. This is why in 2008 there was panic among the UK, USA and EU political class that the bubble was going to burst. The public would discover how we had been deceived for decades. The Wizard of Oz would be exposed as a con man. The dissident economists, for example von Mises, warned that eventually bubbles lead to a crack-up boom. Those who think they are in control of social and economic forces finally find out that the forces are more powerful than human intervention. The public eventually see through the confidence trick. Finally, the masses wake up. They become suddenly aware of the fact that inflation is a deliberate policy and will go on endlessly. A breakdown occurs. The crack-up boom appears. Everybody is anxious to swap his money against real goods, no matter whether he needs them or not, no matter how much money he has to pay for them. Within a very short time, within a few weeks or even days, the things which were used as money are no longer used as media of exchange. They become scrap paper. Nobody wants to give away anything against them. 19th century liberals had been proponents of the free market, but by the early 20th century, even liberals had simply become socialists, which is why the huge biography of Ludwig von Mises is subtitled The Last Night of Liberalism, as in K-N. From 1920 onwards, Mises argued that the socialist economies were at best parasitical on free market economies. Attempts to abolish money and markets in Soviet Russia had produced precisely the chaos that Mises argued was inevitable under full socialism. And we must remember that by the 1930s, socialism was not just to be found in Bolshevik Russia, but also in the Liberal and Labour parties of Britain, National Socialist Germany, Italian fascism, and the American so-called Democratic Party. A world with near zero interest rates, year after year after year, might appear prosperous, but it's only because it's a situation where entire countries are going on national spending sprees with newly created fake money because of coordinated intervention by the oligarchy. But eventually this leads to higher inflation and a further destabilised political and economic system. Then interest rates must return to what is typical over the past century, and the things enabled by cheap money go into reverse. Individuals and entire countries are more in debt, and they must now service that larger debt at higher interest levels which could cause the entire system to collapse. It is important to remember that these unpayable debts do not apply just to households, but to money borrowed by national governments. Individuals may exercise restraint when interest rates are near zero, but governments most certainly will not. In 1990, for example, the US paid $265 billion in interest on $3.2 trillion of debt. In the ensuing 23 years, its debt rose more than fivefold to $16.7 trillion, while its annual interest expense rose by only 57% to £416 billion. This apparent miracle was made possible by the lower interest rates engineered by the Federal Reserve, which dropped the average rate on federal debt from 8.3% to 2.4%. By keeping interest rates low, governments can borrow more money with which to bribe certain tribes in society, or to fund infrastructure projects or conduct aggression against other countries. As we see above, dissident Austrian economists were warning in 2013 and a decade later of the dangers of government borrowing, but the mainstream leftist economists were saying, nah, no problemo. For more than a decade, numerous economists, primarily but not exclusively on the left, had argued that the potential benefits of using debt to finance government spending far outweigh any associated costs. The notion that advanced economies could suffer from debt overhang was widely dismissed, and dissenting voices from debt overhang was widely were often ridiculed. It's that fucking line switch issue I have. I just sometimes go, or when I should be, you know what I mean. Anyway, even the International Monetary Fund, traditionally a stalwart advocate of fiscal prudence, began to support high levels of debt finance stimulus. The tide has turned over the past 2 years, since 2022, as this type of magical thinking collided with the harsh realities of high inflation and return to normal long-term real interest rates. The professor of economics quoted, there thinks that organisations like the IMF are not on the left, but since the Liberals and the Consocialists become leftists a century ago, almost every organisation, national and international, is leftist. For example, the IMF had a DEI agenda, diversity, equity and inclusion, more like divide, I can't think of something for E, and whatever, I'm not going to worry about it, agenda since at least the start of this century, when it is only in recent years that these are seen as the far left social engineering that they are. Whenever the left wants to pillory some organisation as right-wing, they would choose banks, churches, the army, the police, etc., etc. Yet all of these organisations are promoting globalist, pro-transgender, anti-white policies. So even the IMF and the WEF are leftists, despite the filthy rich people running these organisations. Many other countries are in similar positions to the USA, or are in a similar position to the USA, as it says here, as a table of government debt to GDP shows in 2022. So I'm going to read the countries, and then I'm going to showcase the debt. Though apparently, I think they've done a typo here, because they've flipped the B and turned it into a P for whatever reason. Don't ask. So it looks like department rather than debt. So, Japan, debt to GDP, 214%. Italy, 141%. United States, 110. United Kingdom, 101. France, 92. And Germany, 46% debt to GDP. And that is from the IMF 2022. How to escape this financial trap? We have no silver bullet. Your state pension has already been spent by the oligarchy, which is why they claim population replacement is needed. In other words, this is why they claim they want to replace old Whitey here. Whether or not you ever get the kind of retirement you expected is a moot point. Remember, in Animal Farm, despite all the socialist promises, no animal ever got to retire. Private pensions have had their golden age, and people retiring in the next 2 decades are likely on average to get much less from the private pension in what money can buy than those who retired 20 years ago. If you put your money in actual gold, then ownership of gold could be made illegal, as happened in the 1930s and 1960s. Gold jewelry wasn't made illegal then, but who is to say that next time it will remain legal? If you put your money in the stock market or a pension fund, then your money is liable to go down as well as go up, as all the advertisements for financial services are compelled by law to inform people. If you put your money into cryptocurrencies, then which of the 23,000 do you choose? How safe is it? When governments decide to step up financial repression, do you really think they will be unable to stop crypto networks? Look at how readily companies such as YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Google, Amazon, etc., have fallen to pressure from governments. On Twitter or Facebook, you might be told your post has violated some contractual term, or someone has just decided that it has, i.e. someone's feelings got hurt, and your content is banned. On YouTube, comments that contain some word or phrase is flagged end up with the comment just vanishing the second you post it. This should be no surprise to anyone, to be fair, as I'm pretty sure we've all had a comment we've wanted to put on YouTube, but because it had a certain word or phrase, I can think of a few words that they delete on my end involving revolution that they end up deleting, even though I sometimes then go on to say I do not condone it in any way, shape or form. So that bit I don't think should be any surprise to anyone. No warning, no clue as to what you said that is supposedly a violation. How many people in Britain even realise that since 2022 Russian TV and internet companies were quietly blocked across the whole of Europe? Imagine when the oligarchy decided that only their central bank's digital currency should be allowed. Are you prepared to take that risk? When governments make demands, these businesses almost always comply. Crypto exchange Bitstamp now requires users to provide information on their net worth, nationality, proof of residence, and source of funds prior to withdrawing. Some major cryptocurrencies have turned to be fraudulent, with money and directors vanishing or the directors being jailed. Already Bitcoin that never circulated are at a premium, because in the case of the coins that they have never passed through the hands of criminals yet, what this means is that people are increasingly aware that if some coin has passed through the hands of someone designated a criminal, you could lose that coin to the government who sees it. Because all Bitcoin transactions are public records, anyone can trace the path of any individual Bitcoin. This has led to demand for virgin Bitcoins that have never been used in any transaction and are unconnected on the blockchain to any history. So there are many reasons why cryptocurrencies could be another part of the financial trap. Property taxes are only going to go up, as are income taxes. When cities such as London single out certain drivers to tax if they use their car, that's just a prelude to all drivers having to pay per mile. Many people probably thought they could invest in buy-to-let properties and get rich. Certainly we know socialists who own dozens of properties and live off the rent. But they are horrified at the idea that their tenants are now being given more rights. The authors of The Money Bubble pointed out in 2013 that the options open to governments were limited because governments have been pursuing economic insanity for so many decades. The world's governments thus find themselves in an ever-shrinking box, and all it will take to trigger the crisis is a return to historically normal levels of interest rates, As recently as 2000, 30-year Treasury bonds yielded over 6% and 30-year mortgages cost 7.5%. Let rates return to those levels and the global financial system implodes, but continue to force down interest rates by creating trillions of new dollars, euros, and yen, and the near certain result is even bigger asset bubbles and rising inflation culminating into a crack-up boom that will sweep the world's fiat currencies into the dustbin of history. The world is not quite there yet, but we're not far off. At the time of writing, the yield on 30-year US Treasuries is 4.7%, and the base interest rate of the US Central Bank is 5.3%. We should expect them to return to more typical values, i.e. what they have been historically, and when they do, this will cause severe economic and political upheaval. It should come as no surprise that the West is gearing up for what will probably be World War III. After previous wars, governments have ended up more powerful, more socialist, and more repressive. And that is where we will end for today. So we're on page 220 and we're about to enter chapter 4.7, which is rather aptly named World War III. So, definitely a lot to digest from that one. The fact that they're basically trying to keep us from understanding the financial bubble, as it were. Trying to keep our money where they could basically control it. I mean, can I really say I'm surprised? No, not really, because this sounds totally like the establishment and the oligarchies of our current countries. Must admit, though, only 3 strokes this video. And the first stroke came in at about 16 minutes, so I am getting a bit better at it, at least. I mean, it's certainly a damn sight better than 14. Like, that was quite something. But I think I've waffled on enough. So I wish you all a good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world. I'll thank you one last time for watching. And I will see you all in the next one. Bye-bye for now.